Alright, let's go. Every object in this video is real. Every one of them was pulled from the earth, from a shipwreck, from a mine shaft, from the rubble of a construction site, and cataloged by people who had no idea what they were holding. That part is not in dispute. The bronze exists. The clay exists. The metal exists. You can travel to the museums where these things are kept and stand in front of them. What is in dispute is the explanation. Because for over a century, a certain kind of theory has attached itself to objects like these. The theory is that they do not belong to the era in which they were found. The theory is that someone left them there, someone who was not supposed to be there yet. This is internet legend. It is speculation, not fact, and it deserves to be named as such before we begin. No one has ever proven that a traveler from the future dropped a single item on this list. And yet the objects remain. They sit in their cases, dated and labeled, and quietly impossible. They do not answer questions. They ask them. They push us to wonder how much of the past we truly understand, and how much we have simply agreed to stop questioning. Here are 10 of them. Number 10. The Maine penny. In 1957, an amateur archaeologist named Guy Melgren was excavating a Native American site on the coast of Maine, at a place called Naskeag Point. It was a trade site, a location where indigenous peoples had exchanged goods for centuries. Among the thousands of artifacts recovered from the soil, arrowheads, tools, fragments of pottery, worked stone, there was a single small object that did not belong. It was a coin, a tiny worn silver disc, smaller than a modern dime, its stamped imagery so faint it was nearly illegible, its edges irregular from age and handling. Melgren catalogued it as an English penny from the 12th century and moved on. It sat in a collection, unremarkable, for nearly 20 years. Then, in the late 1970s, a specialist examined it more closely. It was not English. It was Norse. It was a silver penny minted in Norway, during the reign of Olaf Kyrre, between the years 1065 and 1080. It had been struck by Viking hands, in a Viking kingdom, on the far side of the Atlantic, more than 4 centuries before Columbus set sail. And it had been found in the ground in Maine, at an indigenous trade site, thousands of miles from any place a Norwegian coin had any business existing. To this day, it remains the only pre-Columbian Norse artifact ever found in the continental United States. That fact deserves to be sat with. The Vikings did reach North America. The settlement at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland confirms it. But that settlement is far to the north, and it left behind Norse tools, Norse construction, Norse debris. The Maine penny left behind nothing but itself. A single coin, with no Viking camp around it, no longhouse, no forge, no companions. One object, sitting alone among the artifacts of a people who had never minted a coin in their lives, in a place no Norseman is known to have walked. The conventional explanation is trade. The coin, scholars propose, may have passed hand to hand along indigenous trade networks, carried south from a point of Norse contact in the north, changing owners over years or decades until it came to rest in Maine as a curiosity, a bead, a trinket, valued for its shine rather than its worth. It is a plausible account. It is also entirely unproven. No trail of intermediate objects has ever been found. The coin simply appears, fully formed, in the wrong hemisphere and the wrong century, with no visible path explaining how it arrived. What makes the Maine penny particularly unsettling is not that it is a forgery. It is not. Its authenticity has been examined and defended. The metallurgy is correct. The minting is correct. The date is correct. Skeptics have proposed that Melgren planted it, that the coin was introduced to the site by a modern hand seeking to manufacture a discovery. But no evidence has ever established this, and the man gained nothing from it. The disturbing part is that everything about the coin is real, and everything about how it got there is a guess. This is the pattern. An object that is exactly what it claims to be, found precisely where it should be impossible. Not a fake, not a mistake, a genuine artifact, correct in every detail, resting in a stratum of history it should never have reached. The coin does not lie. It simply refuses to explain itself. And it is only the first. Because the deeper you dig into the record, the more these objects appear, and the further back the rock around them gets. Number 9. The Clerksdorp spheres. In the mines of South Africa, Deep in the pyrophyllite deposits, near the town of Ottosdal, workers have for decades been pulling small objects out of the rock that should not, by any intuitive reading, be there. They are spheres, small reddish-brown to dark metallic orbs, roughly 1 to 2 inches across. Some are flattened slightly, like a river stone worn smooth. Others are almost perfectly round, and a number of them carry a detail that has fueled the legend more than any other single feature. Around their equators run fine, parallel grooves, circling the object like the seam of a machined part. The rock they are found in is old. Not old in the human sense, not old in the sense of empires or ice ages. The rock is said to be around 3 billion years old. This is not a period in which anything walked, crawled, or built. This is the Precambrian, a world of shallow seas and single cells, a world without eyes to see and without hands to shape. And yet embedded in that ancient stone are objects that look, to the untrained eye, like something turned on a lathe. That is the tension the Clerksdorp spheres have never resolved. They appear manufactured. They do not appear to belong to the era that surrounds them. A grooved metallic sphere is the kind of object a person expects to find in a workshop drawer, not in a seam of rock older than complex life itself. The mind reaches, almost automatically, for an explanation involving intention. Someone made this. Someone placed this. Someone was here. The spheres are composed of pyrite or hematite compounds, iron sulfides and iron oxides, minerals that form under specific chemical conditions over enormous spans of time. And this is where the geologists step in, quietly, without drama. They attribute the spheres to natural mineral concretions. Concretions form when minerals precipitate around a central point, layering outward in the sediment, hardening into rounded masses over the course of millions of years. The process is well understood. It has been observed. It produces, on occasion, shapes so regular that they seem impossible for the Earth to have made without help. The grooves, the geologists say, are natural too. They form along fine layers in the surrounding rock, subtle boundaries in the sediment that leave their mark on the sphere as it grows. What looks like the seam of a machined part is the fingerprint of the rock itself, pressed into the mineral over a span of time no craftsman could ever match. That explanation is almost certainly correct. It fits the chemistry. It fits the geology. It fits everything we understand about how such objects come to exist. And yet the explanation does something the legend never quite forgives it for. It asks us to believe that the Earth, unassisted, produced objects indistinguishable at a glance from something deliberate. It asks us to accept that near-perfect geometry can arise from nothing but pressure, chemistry, and time. What makes the Clerksdorp spheres particularly unsettling is not the possibility that someone left them. It is the possibility that no one did. It is the realization that regularity, symmetry, the appearance of design, are not proof of a designer. The Earth was making perfect spheres a billion years before there was anyone to admire them, and the objects sit now in cabinets and collections, small and grooved and silent, refusing to declare whether they are the work of a hand or the work of time. The next object leaves less room for comfort. It was found not in ancient rock, but beside the bones of the Ice Age. Number 8. The aluminum wedge of Ayud. In 1974, workers on the banks of the Mureș River, near the town of Ayud, in Transylvania, Romania, were excavating sand when they struck something buried many feet below the surface. They pulled 3 objects from the deposit. 2 of them were bones. The bones belonged to a mastodon, an Ice Age relative of the elephant that had vanished from Europe tens of thousands of years earlier. The third object was not a bone. It was a wedge of metal. The workers assumed the metal was a discarded piece of machinery, perhaps a fragment from a dredging tool or an old vehicle. The object measured roughly 8 inches long. It was dull gray, pitted and weathered, its surface corroded into a rough skin. It was heavy. It was shaped, unmistakably, like a wedge, with flattened planes and worn edges that suggested a function rather than an accident. It looked manufactured. It looked, to the men who found it, like something that had been made. When the wedge was eventually analyzed, the results were difficult to reconcile with the context of its discovery. The object was made largely of aluminum. This is the detail that transformed a piece of scrap into a legend. Aluminum does not occur in nature as a usable metal. It exists only bound tightly inside ore, and separating it requires an industrial electrolytic process that consumes enormous amounts of electricity. Aluminum was not produced in any quantity until the 1800s. For most of human history, it was more valuable than gold, precisely because no one could make it. And yet, according to the account, this wedge of aluminum had been pulled from the same sand deposit as the bones of a creature that died in the Ice Age. The surface of the wedge deepened the puzzle. It was coated in a thick oxide layer, the kind of weathering crust that forms on aluminum over long spans of exposure. To some observers, that oxide layer suggested great age. It suggested that the object had been sitting in the earth for a very long time, long enough to develop a skin that fresh aluminum does not have. If the object was old, and if aluminum could not be made until the industrial era, then the object should not exist. A manufactured alloy, in a deposit shared with an animal that predated human industry by tens of thousands of years, is not an anomaly, it is a contradiction. Enthusiasts arrived at the conclusion the contradiction invites. They proposed that the wedge was not human at all. They proposed it had belonged to visitors, that it was a component of something that had come from somewhere else, or somewhen else, and had been left in the Romanian soil to be found by men who had no framework for understanding it. Skeptics have proposed a quieter explanation. They point to the modern excavation equipment operating at the site. A wedge is precisely the kind of hardened metal component used in the teeth of a digging machine, and such a piece, broken off and driven down into the sand during the excavation itself, would end up mingled with whatever the shovel had already disturbed. The oxide layer, they argue, can form far faster than the legend allows. The context in this reading was created by the very act of digging. The wedge itself sits somewhere in a Romanian collection, still gray, still pitted, still wedge-shaped. The dispute over its age has never been definitively settled. What endures is not the metal, it is the image of a manufactured object resting quietly beside the bones of an animal that walked the earth before the metal could have been made. Number 7. The Dorchester Pot. In 1852, workmen were blasting through solid rock during a construction project in Dorchester, Massachusetts. The charge detonated, the stone broke apart, and in the debris, among the shattered fragments of what had, moments earlier, been an unbroken mass of rock, the workers found a metal vessel. It had not been buried in soil. It had not been left in a cavity. According to the account, it had been embedded in the rock itself, split cleanly in two by the explosion, its two halves lying among the rubble like the shell of something that had been sealed inside the stone. The object was a bell-shaped vessel, roughly 4.5 inches tall, flared at its opening like the mouth of a small bell. It was made of a zinc-silver-colored metal, and it was not crude, it was decorated. Delicate vine and flower patterns had been etched into its surface, floral inlays worked with a precision that spoke of a skilled hand and a steady one. This was not a lump of ore, it was an ornament. It was a thing that had been made by someone who cared how it looked. The problem was the rock. The stone the vessel had been blasted from was said to be enormously old. Not centuries, not millennia, geological time, time measured in the slow accumulation of pressure and mineral, the kind of time that predates the human species entirely. If the pot had truly been sealed inside that rock, then the pot was older than the rock's youngest possible age, and the rock was older than anyone who could have made a decorated vase. The implication was plain. Someone had crafted a floral metal vessel before there was anyone alive to craft it. What makes the Dorchester pot particularly unsettling is not the impossibility of its origin, it is the contradiction written into the object itself. Because the craftsmanship does not point backward into deep time. It points, unmistakably, toward the 19th century. The bell shape, the etched vines, the inlaid flowers, the zinc-silver alloy. These are the marks of Victorian-era metalwork. This is the aesthetic of the parlors and mantelpieces of the very decade in which it was found. The vessel does not look like a relic from before humanity. It looks like it was made down the street. And that is the knot no one has ever untied. An object that appears, by every visible feature, to belong to the exact moment it was discovered, reportedly extracted from rock, that should have made its existence impossible. The two facts cannot both be true. One of them has to give. Either the dating of the rock was wrong, or the vessel was never truly inside it, or the account itself grew in the retelling until it hardened into something more certain than the evidence allowed. Skeptics have proposed the obvious. A Victorian vase, dropped into loose debris, mistaken in the confusion of a blast for something that had come out of the stone. A story that improved with each mouth it passed through. A craftsman's ornament, reassigned to the dawn of time. But the vessel remains what it always was. A small, flared, silver-colored thing, patterned with flowers, that appeared in the wrong place, at the wrong depth, in the wrong stone. It was too finely made to be ancient. It was found somewhere ancient things are found. And it has never comfortably belonged to either explanation. That gap between what an object looks like and where it was found is precisely where these legends breed. The next one shows exactly how quickly such a gap can close. Number 6. The Koso artifact. In 1961, 3 rockhounds named Wallace Lane, Virginia Maxey, and Mike Mikesell were searching for geodes in the hills near Olancha, California. They collected an unremarkable stone, gray and rough, the kind of nodule that promises crystal on the inside. They took it home. They cut it open with a diamond saw. And inside the stone, where there should have been mineral, there was metal. The cross-section revealed something no geode had ever contained. A shiny cylindrical core, sheathed in what appeared to be ceramic, surrounded by the weathered shell of ordinary rock. When the object was X-rayed, the images showed a metal core wrapped in ceramic material, with a spring or a ring visible at one end. It was manufactured, it was precise, and it was, according to the enthusiasts who first examined the surrounding stone, encased in a concretion they estimated to be 500,000 years old. The implication was immediate and enormous. If the rock was 500,000 years old, and the object was sealed inside the rock, then the object had been made 500,000 years ago. No human civilization existed then. No hand capable of shaping ceramic and metal to a tolerance like this had yet evolved. The Koso artifact became, almost overnight, a centerpiece of the out-of-place artifact literature. It was cited in books, it was reproduced in diagrams, it was offered as physical proof that someone had been here before us, or would be, and had left a machine behind in the deep past. The problem was the object itself. Investigators who looked at it without the assumption of impossibility recognized what they were seeing. It was a spark plug. Specifically, it matched a champion spark plug of a type manufactured in the 1920s. The shiny core was the electrode. The ceramic was the insulator. The spring was the spring. The object was not 500,000 years old. It was, at the time of its discovery, roughly 40. The gray shell that had looked like an ancient geode was not stone at all in the geological sense. It was a concretion, a hardened crust of iron oxide, clay, and mineral deposit that can form around a buried object in years, not eons. A spark plug dropped in the desert, exposed to moisture and the chemistry of the surrounding soil, can acquire a convincing mineral coat within a human lifetime. The rock had not preserved a mystery. The rock had grown around a piece of a car. What makes the Koso case particularly unsettling is not the object. The object was mundane the moment anyone examined it honestly. What is unsettling is the timeline of the belief itself. The story became a legend before the debunking caught up. By the time investigators had matched it to a champion spark plug, the artifact had already traveled the world in print, already been enshrined as evidence, already convinced people who would never encounter the correction. This is the mechanism worth watching. A claim moves at the speed of wonder. A correction moves at the speed of tedium. The 500,000-year-old machine was thrilling, and it spread. The 40-year-old spark plug was boring, and it did not. Decades later, the artifact still surfaces in discussions of impossible objects, its debunking trailing behind it like a rumor no one bothered to finish reading. The Koso artifact is a lesson in how error outruns truth. The stone was cut open. The metal was named. And still the legend walks, 500,000 years ahead of the facts, in a shape that was never as old as it looked. Number 5. The Saqqara bird. In 1898, during an excavation of a tomb at Saqqara, the vast necropolis south of Cairo, archaeologists recovered a small wooden object that would sit in a museum drawer for decades before anyone thought to look at it twice. It was catalogued, labeled, and shelved among the bird figurines that ancient Egyptian tombs produced by the thousands. It attracted no attention. It carried no inscription of note. It was dated to roughly 200 BCE, and it was, by every conventional measure, Unremarkable. The object is carved from a single piece of sycamore wood. It weighs under an ounce. It measures about 7 inches across the wingspan, pale tan, smooth, worn by time into a surface that catches the light. It has a bird-like head. It has outstretched wings. And for the first half of the century after its discovery, no one saw anything in it but a bird. Then, someone did. What makes the Saqqara bird case particularly unsettling is not the age of the object. It is the shape. Because when a certain kind of eye looks at the wings, at the way they angle back from the body, at the vertical fin rising from the tail, the eye does not see a sparrow or a falcon. It sees a glider. It sees a fixed-wing aircraft. It sees a profile that would not appear in the human record for another 2,000 years, and that would not fly until the 20th century. Enthusiasts have argued that the proportions are aerodynamic. They have pointed to the tail, which no living bird possesses in that vertical orientation. They have noted that the wings are not spread as a bird spreads them in flight, but set, angled downward at the tips, in the manner of a machine designed to generate lift. They have built replicas. They have tested them. They have claimed the object would glide if launched, that it embodies a principle of flight its supposed makers could not have understood. Egyptologists do not accept this. To them, the Saqqara bird is a bird. It is a sculpture, or possibly a weather vane, or a ceremonial object of a kind the culture produced in great number. The vertical tail, they say, is stylization, not engineering. The aerodynamic reading is a modern mind imposing a modern silhouette on an ancient hand that meant nothing of the sort. This is the more sober explanation, and it is almost certainly the correct one. But the aerodynamic profile sparked decades of speculation regardless, and the speculation did not need the scholar's permission to spread. It fed a larger idea, the idea that the ancient world had known things it should not have known, that somewhere in the deep past a shape had been carved that seemed to remember the future. And this is the quieter, stranger discomfort the object leaves behind. Not the claim that Egyptians flew. That claim collapses under the first hard look. The discomfort is that a form can outrun its maker's intent. A carver in the 2nd century before Christ shaped a piece of sycamore into something, and 2,000 years later it resembles a thing he could not have imagined, could not have named, could not have dreamed. The resemblance is an accident. It has to be an accident. Unless resemblance is how a message survives when the language to explain it has been lost. The Saqqara bird cannot tell us which. It has no words. It offers only its shape and its silence, and the uneasy sense that some objects seem to know more than the people who made them. Number 4. The Voynich manuscript. In the early 1400s, somewhere in Central Europe, a scribe sat down with a stack of prepared vellum and began to write a book that no one has ever been able to read. Carbon dating places the animal skins in the first decades of the 15th century. The ink sits in the fibers. The binding is old. The book is unquestionably a genuine artifact of the late medieval world. It now rests in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, catalogued, photographed, digitized, and available to anyone who wishes to look at it. And in 600 years, no one who has looked at it has understood a single word. The manuscript runs to roughly 240 pages in soft browns and faded greens. The script flows across every page in a looping, confident hand, the hand of someone who knew exactly what they were writing. It does not read like the work of a hesitant forger. There are no corrections of the kind a person inventing gibberish would make. The characters recur with statistical regularity. They cluster into what appear to be words, and the words into what appear to be sentences, and the sentences follow patterns that resemble the structure of a real language. But the language matches nothing. Not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, not Arabic, not any Slavic or Romance tongue, not any cipher of the period, not any known writing system on the historical record. Alongside the text are the drawings, plants that correspond to no species any botanist has ever catalogued, with roots and leaves and flowers that do not exist in nature. Astronomical charts arranging stars and suns in configurations no one has mapped. And the figures, small human forms, mostly women, bathing in green pools connected by networks of tubes and channels that look less like plumbing than like something biological, something internal. No one knows what any of it means. What makes the Voynich manuscript particularly unsettling is not that it is undeciphered. Many old texts are hard to read. It is that it has defeated the people whose entire profession is reading the unreadable. The manuscript passed through the hands of the most accomplished codebreakers of the 20th century, the same minds who broke the ciphers of 2 world wars, who cracked machine-generated codes designed by governments to be unbreakable. They applied every tool they had: frequency analysis, pattern recognition, eventually, computational modeling, and they failed. Every one of them failed. 6 centuries of the finest analytical minds available in each era, and the book has surrendered nothing. Skeptics have proposed that it is an elaborate hoax, a beautiful nonsense assembled to defraud a wealthy collector. But the statistical structure of the text argues against it. Meaningless gibberish does not obey the mathematical laws that natural languages obey, and the Voynich text obeys several of them. It behaves like language. It simply behaves like no language that has ever been spoken. Consider the possibility the legend prefers. Consider that the reason no linguist can place the script, no historian can source the botany, no astronomer can find the sky it maps, is that none of them exist yet. Consider that a book written in the 15th century might be encoded in a language that had not been invented in the 15th century, and may not be invented in ours. A message left in plain sight, on shelves, in libraries, in high-resolution scans open to the entire world, waiting for the century that can finally read it. The manuscript is real, the vellum is real, the ink is real, and the words remain sealed, addressed to someone who is not us, not yet. Number 3. The London Hammer. In 1936, near the town of London, Texas, a couple walking along a creek bed noticed a piece of wood protruding from a rock. This was not remarkable in itself. Rocks weather, objects lodge in them. What was remarkable was what the wood turned out to be attached to. When the concretion was later broken open, it revealed an iron hammerhead, crude and rust brown, roughly 6 inches long, jutting from a pale, cracked shell of stone. The wooden handle was still attached. Part of it had begun to turn to a coal-like material, as though the years had been pressing it slowly toward mineral. The object itself is ordinary. A hammer of this shape would not have been out of place in any 19th century American workshop. It is the container that made it famous. The rock encasing the hammer has been claimed by some to be hundreds of millions of years old, laid down in an era when no human hand existed to swing a tool, when the ancestors of mammals had not yet appeared, when the continents themselves sat in different positions on the map. If the claim were true, the implications would be total. A manufactured iron hammer, sealed inside stone that predates humanity by a margin measured in geological epochs, does not fit anywhere in the accepted account of how the world was made. There is no version of history in which a Texas creek bed produces a hand tool older than the dinosaurs. The object would not merely be strange. It would be a hole punched through the entire timeline. This is why the London hammer became the archetype. It gave a name to a whole category of objects that enthusiasts call out-of-place artifacts, things that appear to exist in the wrong stratum of time, things that seem to have been left behind by someone who arrived far too early. For decades, it circulated through the literature of the impossible, photographed, catalogued, held up as the single clearest piece of evidence that the past is not what the textbooks describe, a modern tool in ancient rock. The proof, its defenders said, was in the stone, but the stone is where the story quietly collapses. Geologists who examined the concretion pointed to something the legend tends to leave out. Rock does not always require hundreds of millions of years to form. Under the right conditions, minerals dissolved in groundwater will precipitate and harden around a foreign object far faster than intuition suggests. A hammer dropped in the wrong creek, in water carrying the right dissolved compounds, can be sheathed in a shell of mineral concretion within a span of years, not eons. The rock is not a clock recording the hammer's age. It is a crust that grew around it long after it was made. The truly disturbing aspect of the London hammer case is not the hammer. It is how little it took to build the myth, and how much it takes to unbuild it. The object needed only to be found, photographed, and described with the word ancient attached. The explanation needed decades of patient work in a language most people never learn, and even now, the correction has never fully caught the story. The hammer is almost certainly a 19th century tool. The rock almost certainly grew around it in ordinary time. And still the image endures. An iron head locked in stone, waiting for anyone who wants to believe that someone came before us, carrying tools they should not have owned. The next object asks less of the rock and more of the electricity. Number 2. The Baghdad Battery. Sometime before 1938, in a collection near Baghdad, an archaeologist catalogued a set of clay jars that should have been unremarkable. They were pottery. The region produced pottery by the ton. Jars like these had been unearthed by the thousands, and none of them had ever caused anyone to lose sleep. This one did. The jar was a yellowish terracotta pot about 5 inches tall. Inside it was a copper cylinder. Inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod. The 3 components fit together in a configuration that served no obvious ceremonial purpose, held no scrolls comfortably, and stored nothing a potter would have wanted stored. The arrangement was deliberate, it was engineered, and to a certain kind of observer, it looked less like a container and more like a device. The jars are dated to the Parthian or Sassanid era, somewhere in the wide corridor between 250 BCE and 650 CE. This places them at least 1,000 years before the phenomenon they appear to anticipate, because when researchers reconstructed the design and filled the jar with an acidic liquid like vinegar, the assembly did something that clay is not supposed to do. It produced roughly 1 volt of electricity. Not a spark, not a trick, a small, steady, measurable current, generated by a container built before the concept of a current existed. The implication arrived immediately, and it was staggering. Alessandro Volta announced the first electrical battery in the year 1800. He is credited, correctly, as the man who gave humanity a portable source of stored electricity. And here was an object that appeared to predate his invention by nearly 2 millennia. A working battery, buried in the soil of Mesopotamia, sealed inside a jar that had been fired in a kiln by hands that never saw a light bulb, a wire, or a switch. The explanations came quickly, and they are reasonable. Many scholars think the jars were used for storage or for holding scrolls, the copper and iron serving some mundane purpose, lost to the record. The electrical output, they argue, is a coincidence of geometry. Assemble almost any 2 dissimilar metals in an acidic bath, and you will get a voltage whether you intended to or not. The current does not prove intent. It proves only that the ancient world contained, by accident, the ingredients of a discovery it never made. This is almost certainly correct. And yet the accident is the disturbing part. What makes the Baghdad battery particularly unsettling is not the question of whether the ancients built a battery on purpose. It is the possibility that they built one without knowing what they held. That a technology which would eventually rewire every hour of human life sat in a clay jar for 2,000 years, generating its faint current for no one, waiting for a civilization capable of recognizing it. The knowledge was present, the comprehension was not. The gap between the object and the understanding of the object was the width of history itself. Consider what that means for the objects we hold now. Consider the possibility that the tools capable of transforming the next era are already in our hands, already producing their quiet signal, and that we, like the potters of Parthia, are simply not equipped to read what we are looking at. The jar is real. The voltage is real. The intent may never be known. And the strangest thing about the Baghdad battery is not that someone from the future left it behind. It is that someone from the past may have made it, and never once suspected what it could do. Number 1. The Antikythera mechanism. In 1901, sponge divers working the seabed off the Greek island of Antikythera surfaced from a Roman-era shipwreck carrying an object no one could identify. It was a corroded lump of bronze about the size of a shoebox, fractured into 82 pieces, blue-green with the patience of 2,000 years underwater. It sat in a museum drawer for decades, dismissed as a curiosity, a broken instrument, a piece of ballast. It was none of those things. The mechanism dates to roughly 100 to 150 BCE. Inside its corroded shell are at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, cut and meshed with a precision that has no business existing in the ancient world. When researchers finally understood what they were looking at, the conclusion was not a matter of interpretation. The device predicted eclipses. It tracked the positions of the planets. It modeled the motion of the sun and the moon across the sky, accounting for the irregularities of the lunar orbit that would not be mathematically described in Europe for another 15 centuries. Faded Greek inscriptions are still visible on its dials, instructions written by hands that understood exactly what they had built. It is often called the world's first analog computer. That description is not hyperbole. It is the most literal available. What makes the Antikythera mechanism particularly unsettling is not that it is old. It is that its complexity was not matched by any known device for over 1,000 years afterward. Nothing approaching this sophistication appears again until the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe. There is no lineage. There is no chain of gradually improving instruments leading up to it, and none leading away from it. It arrives fully formed, sits alone in the historical record, and then the knowledge it represents vanishes for a millennium. The gears that turned in that Greek workshop would not turn again anywhere on Earth until the descendants of the men who made them had forgotten their ancestors could count. Skeptics have proposed that we simply lost the other examples, that there was a tradition of Greek gearwork, a school of instrument makers, and the ships that carried their output to the bottom of the sea. This is possible. It is also, in its way, more disturbing than the alternative, because it means an entire technological culture existed, flourished, and disappeared so completely that a single accident of preservation is the only reason we know it existed at all. Had the sponge divers surfaced 10 meters to the left, the ancient world would still be, in our histories, a place of columns and philosophy, and no machines. And that is the meditation that this object leaves in the room, the one that every artifact before it has been circling. We tell ourselves a story about the past. We arrange it into a line that rises steadily from ignorance toward us, with ourselves at the summit, the inheritors of everything that came before. The Antikythera mechanism does not fit that line. It is a piece of the past that was more advanced than the past is allowed to be, recovered by accident, understood by luck, and still not fully explained. It does not prove a visitor from tomorrow left it behind. It proves something quieter and harder to dismiss. It proves that the record is full of holes, that the story we have assembled is thinner than we admit, and that the people who came before us knew things we assumed they could not have known. We are not standing at the summit. We are standing on a coastline, and most of the ship is still underwater. 10 objects, 10 impossibilities, and every one of them, without exception, is real. The Antikythera mechanism sits in Athens. The Voynich manuscript rests at Yale. The Maine penny is catalogued, photographed, measured, held. These are not hoaxes assembled to fool the credulous. They were pulled from shipwrecks and tombs and quarry walls by people who had no reason to lie and no idea what they had found. That part is not in dispute. That part is history. What is legend is the visitor, the idea that someone stepped out of a future that had not yet arrived and left these things behind, deliberately or by accident, in the wrong century. There is no evidence for that. There never was. The time traveler is a story we tell because the alternative is harder to sit with. Because what makes these objects endure is not proof of anyone from tomorrow. It is the way they push us to question how much of the past we actually understand. Every one of them marks a place where our confidence cracked, where the timeline we thought was settled turned out to have a seam in it we had never noticed. The most thrilling mystery is never the answer. It is the question that refuses to go away. And these 10 questions have refused for a very long time. They will outlast us. They will still be sitting in their glass cases when we are the ancient ones, the strange people from a century somebody else cannot quite explain. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.